Serafina Ravello slid a thick envelope across the marble table, like she was tipping a waitress she despised. Take it, leave my son. Micah stays with the Ravellos. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Women like Serafina had spent decades learning that cruelty harder when it's delivered quietly, the way you discuss the weather or a dry cleaning bill. Amani looked at the envelope. Then she looked at her 7-year-old son pressed against her hip, his small fingers curled into the fabric of her sleeve. She had been through this before. Not the envelope that was new, but the room. The silence. The way Serafina looked at her, like she was something that had wandered in from outside and hadn't yet been removed. What Serafina didn't know, what none of them knew, was that on the other side of that door, a man who had ordered people hurt for lesser offenses was standing completely still, and for the first time in his adult life, he had no idea what to do with his hands. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly who I made it for. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Drop your city and country in the comments to see how far this story travels. And if this one moves you, leave a like. It tells me to keep going. The drive from JFK should have taken 2 hours. Dominic Ravello made it in 93 minutes, which was not unusual. His driver knew better than to comment on speed, traffic laws, or the fact that they had blown through 4 yellow lights and 1 red one that had turned just a half-second too early for a reasonable man to keep going. Dominic was not, in most respects, a reasonable man. He had been in Charlotte for 3 weeks. Before that, Philadelphia. Before that, a series of conversations in back rooms and secured hotel suites that he would never write down and never discuss with anyone who didn't already know. That was the nature of his business, not the legitimate real estate holdings, or the restaurant group, or the 3 car dealerships his accountant managed with impressive efficiency. The other business, the one that put the signet ring on his finger, and the gray at his temples, and the particular kind of stillness in his eyes that made people in rooms decide to find somewhere else to be. He was 36 years old and looked 42 in the wrong light, and 30 in photographs his wife took of him laughing, which he never did enough of, according to her. The gift was in a black shopping bag on the seat beside him. A remote-controlled car for Micah, not the cheap kind. The kind with the real rubber tires and the working headlights that Micah had pointed to on a website 6 weeks ago, with the specific intensity that 7-year-olds reserve for the things they want, so badly they don't even ask out loud because asking feels dangerous. Dominic had ordered it the same evening. He wasn't a man who forgot what his son wanted. The bracelet for Amani was in his jacket pocket. Square-cut diamonds in white gold, modest, by the standards of what he could have bought, which was exactly why he chose it. Amani had a complicated relationship with expensive things. She accepted them, wore them, thanked him genuinely, and then sometimes looked at them a certain way when she thought he wasn't watching, like she was calculating a debt she hadn't agreed to. He had never quite understood that about her. He understood it slightly better now than he had at 27 when they met, and slightly better still than he had at 29 when they married. But he could not claim to fully understand it. What he understood was that she was the most honest person in his life, which in his life was a distinction that came with very little competition. His mother's Connecticut house appeared through the trees, the way it always did, large, pale, and permanent, like it had always been there and would remain long after everyone inside it was gone. His father had bought it in 1987. Dominic had grown up between this house and the Brooklyn apartment and had spent the years since his father's death watching his mother treat both properties like kingdoms she was managing in trust for a king who was temporarily absent. He told his driver to stop at the gate and walk up. He did this, sometimes arrived without the car announcing him, without the sound of tires on the gravel. Not for any professional reason today. He was simply tired, and there was something about walking the last 100 yards through cold air that helped him decompress before stepping back into whatever version of domestic life was waiting. He was carrying the shopping bag. He had the bracelet in his pocket. He was thinking about Micah's face when he saw the car, and about whether Amani had eaten anything real today, because she had a habit of surviving on coffee when she was stressed, and she'd sounded stressed on the phone 2 nights ago. Though when he asked about it, she said she was fine, and he believed her, because she usually was. He pushed through the side door, the one off the garden, and moved through the narrow hall that led past the kitchen toward the main drawing room, where his mother held court in the afternoons. He heard his mother's voice before he reached the doorway. He stopped. Not because of the tone, his mother had many tones, and he had catalogued them all over a lifetime. He stopped because of the silence that followed the first sentence he caught, a particular quality of silence, the kind that exists in a room where someone has just been handed something they never wanted to receive. Stayed where he was. He didn't announce himself. He didn't move. He simply stood in the hallway with a shopping bag in his hand and a diamond bracelet in his pocket, and listened to his mother explain to his wife exactly what she was worth. The envelope came first. He heard the specific sound of thick paper sliding across marble, a sound he associated with certain kinds of finality. Take it, leave my son. Micah stays with the Ravellos. Dominic's grip tightened on the shopping bag handles. Amani didn't respond immediately. He knew her silences. The way he knew her voice, there were different kinds. This one wasn't shock. She had heard something like this before. He could hear the lack of surprise in the quiet, and that realization settled into him like cold water. Then Micah made a small sound, and Dominic heard his wife pull their son closer. His mother kept talking. Serafina Ravello had the particular gift of people who have never been required to feel shame. She spoke her cruelest sentences in the same voice she used to order dinner, which made them somehow worse. She told Amani that Dominic needed a woman from their world, a woman who understood what the Ravello name meant and what it required. She told Amani in the careful language of someone who has learned which words leave marks that can't be photographed, that she had never been worthy of the name she carried. She did not use certain words. She didn't need to. She had spent 9 years learning which implications landed hardest without the legal exposure of explicit language. Dominic stood in the hallway and understood for the first time with total clarity what his wife had been living inside every time he left a room. He didn't move yet. He told himself later that he waited because he needed to hear more. That was partially true. The other part, the part he admitted to himself only in the dark, much later, was that some piece of him was still hoping for an explanation that would make this something other than what it was. Some context that would soften it. His mother was difficult. His mother didn't always understand. His mother came from a different time, and her words sounded worse than she meant them on. He had said all of these things to Amani. He remembered saying them, clearly, multiple times. He remembered the particular way Amani would look at him after he said them. Not angry, not even hurt, exactly. Just tired. A specific kind of tired that he had filed away under the category of Amani being sensitive, which he now recognized as one of the more spectacular failures of perception in his adult life. Inside the room, his mother was explaining the situation with Micah in terms that were careful and precise and absolutely devastating. She spoke about the Ravello bloodline, about what Micah deserved as an heir, about the difference between being Micah's mother biologically and being capable of raising him in the environment he deserved. Every sentence was technically about Micah. None of it was about Micah. And then Dominic became aware of a third presence in the room, a voice he recognized after a moment as Bianca Valenti, the daughter of one of his mother's associates, a woman his mother had mentioned at various points over the years with specific deliberateness, always when Imani was in earshot, always with reference to her education and elegance and understanding of the world. Dominic moved in. The sound of Bianca's presence in that room landed on Dominic like a physical weight. His mother hadn't just bought an envelope of cash and made a speech. She had staged a replacement. The calculation of it, the patience, the planning, the specific cruelty of bringing another woman into the room, so Amani would understand the message in 3 dimensions hit him somewhere behind the sternum and stayed there. He heard Amani take one slow breath, and then his wife started talking. Imani's voice, when she finally found it, was not loud. It was not dramatic. It didn't have the trembling quality that Serafina probably expected, the tearful crumbling of a woman who could be bought or frightened into leaving. Amani spoke the way she always spoke, when she was past the point of managing anyone's feelings, including her own. Level. Each word placed down like she was setting stones. She said she had been in this house, in rooms like this one, for 9 years. She said she had watched Serafina's face change the moment Dominic's back was turned. She had heard the comments about her family, her background, Her neighborhood in Baltimore where she grew up, the way Serafina said, Baltimore, the way other people said unfortunate with a kind of practiced sympathy that contained no sympathy at all. She said she had hurt herself compared to other women so many times that she had started to feel like she was living inside a competition she had never entered and couldn't win because the rules changed depending on what Serafina needed her to lose. Dominic pressed his back against the hallway wall. He was not a man who leaned on walls. He stood very straight. Always it was a physical habit built over years. But right now he needed something to hold him up that wasn't his own legs. Because Imani was saying the things she had tried to say to him. He was hearing them clearly for the first time because there was no Serafina in the room denying them. There was no mother telling him sweetly that Imani had misunderstood. There was no alternative explanation being offered by the person whose explanation he had consistently chosen over his wife's. There was just Imani's voice laying out 9 years of evidence in the calm, specific language of a woman who had stopped expecting to be rescued and was simply finally telling the truth out loud because she was done carrying it alone. But he heard her voice catch once, just once, then steady again. Then Serafina's chair scraped against the floor. Then his son screamed. Not a child's tantrum scream, not the elevated pitch of a kid who doesn't get what he wants. This was a scared sound. Sharp and small and disbelieving, and it sliced through everything Dominic was feeling and replaced it with something simpler and more absolute. He was moving before he decided to move. The door opened inward, and Dominic stepped into the room, and the first thing he registered was his mother's hand on Micah's arm and his mother's face when she heard the door, and the way that face changed the color, leaving it in one visible second. The careful composure she had maintained for the entire conversation, disassembling with a speed that told him everything about how she had truly expected this afternoon to end. She had expected to be alone with Imani. She had expected no witnesses she couldn't manage. Dominic stood in the doorway of his mother's drawing room, with a child's birthday present in one hand and his heart hammering against the inside of his chest, and looked at his wife. Imani looked back at him. He wanted to read her expression and found that he couldn't, not entirely. There was something in it he'd seen before and hadn't understood before. She wasn't looking at him with hope. She was looking at him the way you look at a situation you've accepted the outcome of, and you're watching to see if reality matches what you already prepared yourself for. She was waiting to see which way he was going to go. That hit him harder than anything his mother had said. His wife of 9 years, mother of his child, the woman he would have told anyone who asked that he would do anything, for she was standing in the room looking at him, and not assuming he would take her side, because he had not, historically, taken her side. And she had learned that, and he had taught her that, and no amount of money or bodyguards or reputation had protected her from the specific damage that does. Serafina released Micah's arm. She straightened her posture. She said, "Dominic, this isn't what you think." He had heard that sentence before. In different rooms from different people, under very different circumstances. He knew exactly what it meant. It meant, I know what you saw, and I would prefer you to believe something else. He said, I heard everything. The room went very quiet. Micah pulled away from his grandmother and crossed the room to his mother, pressing his face against Imani's inside. Imani's hand moved to her son's back, automatically not looking down at him, keeping her eyes on Dominic, that same careful expression. Still waiting. Bianca Valenti was standing near the window. She looked like someone at a dinner party who had discovered mid-appetizer that she had accepted an invitation to something genuinely terrible. There was a particular kind of horror on her face that Dominic recognized as the horror of a person who is not bad being forced to recognize what bad looks like up close. His mother began talking. She used the word bloodline twice in the first 90 seconds, which was her tell. When Serafina retreated into the language of bloodlines and legacy and what the Ravello name required, it meant she had decided the best defense was to reframe the entire conversation around something larger than herself, to make what she had done sound like duty. Dominic walked toward the table. He looked at the envelope. He picked it up. He felt the weight of it heavy, the kind of weight that means whoever assembled it was serious, meant to offer enough that refusal would feel foolish. His mother had thought about the right number. She had calculated what Imani's departure was worth, and put it in paper and bound it with a rubber band. He turned the envelope over in his hands. How much is my wife's dignity worth? His mother didn't answer. He noticed she was watching his hands specifically, the tattooed knuckles, the signet ring, the way his fingers moved over the envelope. He knew what she was looking for. She had known him for 36 years. She knew the difference between his neutral expression and his controlled expression, and she was trying to determine which one she was seeing. What she wasn't prepared for was a third option. He didn't tear the envelope. Not yet. He held it and looked at the table and then at his wife and then at the window where Bianca stood with her arms crossed over her chest and her eyes on the floor. He asked Bianca, "Did you know why you were invited here today?" Bianca looked up. She shook her head once, genuinely. He believed her. "I thought it was a family lunch. I didn't know until..." She stopped. Looked at Amani. "I didn't know." Amani made a small sound. Not a laugh, not a cry. Something in between that had no good name. Serafina said, "Bianca, don't what?" Bianca said, and her voice had shifted from discomfort into something harder. "Don't tell her the truth? I've been sitting in this room for 45 minutes watching. You talk to this woman like she's a problem you're removing, and you want me to. You're a guest in this house," Serafina said, with all the particular chill of a woman reminding someone of the hierarchy. "No," Bianca said. She uncrossed her arms. "I'm really not. Not anymore." She looked at Amani again, with something that wasn't pity, it was cleaner than pity. It was acknowledgement. Woman to woman, the specific acknowledgement of recognizing a battle you didn't know someone else was fighting. "I'm sorry," Bianca said to Imani. "I should have gotten up and left an hour ago. I didn't understand fast enough what I was being used for." Serafina said her name sharply. Bianca picked up her bag and walked out. The sound of her heels on the marble floor was very clear in the silence that followed, and then the front door, and then nothing. Serafina stood with 3 people in her drawing room, and the particular stillness of someone who has watched their carefully arranged plan remove itself from the table one piece at a time. Dominic looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he opened the envelope and tore it in half, and then again, and dropped the pieces and the money onto the marble table, where it's spread out in the casual way that large amounts of cash do when they're no longer bound together. Expensive and meaningless. Micah had his arms around his mother now. His face was still against her side. He had stopped crying, but his breathing was uneven, the hitching quality it had when he was trying to get himself under control, the way he'd seen the adults around him get themselves under control. Dominic lowered himself to one knee in front of his son. Micah looked at him with his mother's eyes. That was the thing about Micah. He had Dominic's coloring in some ways, but Imani's eyes exactly. And right now those eyes were red-rimmed and searching and asking a question Micah didn't have the words for yet. He found the words anyway. "Daddy," Micah said, in the small, careful voice of a child who has been in a room with adult pain for too long. "Are you going to make Mommy leave?" The question undid something in Dominic's chest that he hadn't known was still held together. He put his hand on his son's face. "No," he said, and meant it with everything that existed in him. Micah held onto his father's hand for a second, then leaned back against his mother. Dominic stood. He looked at Amani. She was watching him, still with that careful expression, still not assuming, still waiting. 9 years of their marriage. And this was what it had come to. She was standing in his mother's house at the end of a confrontation she had survived alone, and she was looking at her husband and wondering if he was going to say something that mattered. He had said so many things to her over 9 years that hadn't mattered, wrapped in the form of things that should have. "I should have listened to you," he said years ago. It wasn't an eloquent sentence. It wasn't the speech she deserved, or the apology that covered everything. It was just the most accurate thing he could say right now with his son in her arms and his mother's money on the table. Amani closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. Not with relief he knew her face, even when he hadn't always known what it was telling him. This wasn't relief. This was the specific exhaustion of someone who has been waiting to hear something so long that hearing it doesn't feel triumphant. It feels like putting down a weight you forgot you were carrying. He crossed the room to her. He didn't reach for her. Immediately, he stood close enough and let her decide. She leaned into him, one hand still on Micah's back, her forehead against Dominic's shoulder. He stood with his wife and his son in the middle of his mother's drawing room, surrounded by pieces of an envelope that represented everything Serafina thought love could be converted into, and he held them. Behind him, Serafina Ravello stood alone for the first time that afternoon, and she has no speech for it. She had prepared for Amani's departure, for Dominic's justifications, for Bianca's elegant presence across the table. She had not prepared for this, for the weight of being left standing by the people she thought she controlled through sheer accumulated authority. Dominic spoke without turning around. "We're going home," he said. "We'll talk about everything else later." And his mother, for the first time he could remember, had nothing to say. He walked his wife and his son out of that drawing room and through the hallway and out into the cold air, and the shopping bag with the remote-controlled car was still in his hand, and the bracelet was still in his pocket. And for once those things felt like exactly the wrong kind of offering. Not because they weren't good gifts, but because none of it was what she had needed from him. He put Micah in the car first, got him buckled, tucked a jacket around his legs. Then he stood outside the car door for a second, in the cold, with his driver waiting, and the house still visible through the trees, and let himself feel the full weight of what the last 30 minutes had cost him. Not cost him the way he usually calculated cost. Not money or loyalty or positioning. He had spent 9 years being the most protected man in any room he entered, and the whole time, the person standing next to him had been unprotected, and he had arranged that through the specific violence of not looking directly at something, because looking at it required him to do something about it. He got in the car. He didn't look back at the house. Micah fell asleep before they reached the highway, the way small children do suddenly and completely, his head tipping sideways, one hand still curled loosely on the seat. Dominic looked at him for a long time, then looked forward. Beside him, Amani sat with her hands in her lap. Not close to him, not far, just present. The way she was present when she was thinking through something she wasn't ready to say yet. He reached over and put his hand over hers. She turned her palm up. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The highway stretched ahead of them through the dark, and whatever came next was going to require something more than a confrontation in a drawing room. Something quieter and harder and more honest than anything Dominic Ravello was trained for. But for right now, she was holding his hand, and Micah was asleep, and that was enough to carry them toward whatever was waiting on the other side of this night. The house was too quiet when they got home. That was the first thing Dominic noticed, not the absence of sound exactly, but the quality of it. The Brooklyn townhouse where they lived during the week had its own noise signature. The radiator that knocked in the upstairs hallway, the neighbor's dog 2 doors down, the low electrical hum of the kitchen appliances. He had lived with those sounds for 6 years and barely registered them anymore. Tonight they were too loud and too empty at the same time, which was the kind of contradiction that made no logical sense and made complete emotional sense. He carried Micah up the stairs, still asleep, one arm under the boy's knees, Micah's head against his shoulder in the boneless way of children who trust completely, even in unconsciousness. He laid him in his bed and pulled off his shoes, small shoes, worn at the left heel more than the right, because Micah pushed off that foot when he ran, which he did constantly, and pulled the blanket up and stood in the dark of his son's room for longer than necessary. Looking at Micah's face, slack with sleep, his mother's eyes closed. Dominic had spent years looking at his son and feeling something clean and uncomplicated, one of the very few uncomplicated things in his life. Right now, looking at Micah felt complicated too, because he was seeing the afternoon through Micah's eyes. Now his grandmother's hand on his arm, the sound of his mother's voice being methodically taken apart across a marble table, and what it must have meant to a 7-year-old boy who loved both of those women and understood nothing of why the room felt so dangerous. He closed Micah's door softly. In the hallway he stood for a second, listening. Downstairs, Amani was in the kitchen. He could hear water running, the specific sound of her filling the kettle, which she did when she wasn't hungry but needed something to do with her hands. He went downstairs. She had her back to him, standing at the counter, watching the kettle like it owed her something. She still had her coat on, which meant she hadn't decided yet whether she was staying in this kitchen or needed to be somewhere else. He sat down at the island. Neither of them spoke for about 2 minutes. Kettle began to build. The water sound shifted from cold to heating, that low pre-boil tremor, and Amani turned and looked at him, and he looked back, and the silence between them had texture now, not the comfortable silence of 9 years of familiarity, but something with edges, something that required care. She poured the water, set a mug in front of him, even though he hadn't asked for any, kept one for herself, sat down across from him. He noticed her hands around the mug. She wasn't drinking, just holding it, warming them. You didn't know she had money in that envelope, she said. It wasn't a question. No, but you're not surprised. He thought about denying that. The denial was right there, available, the kind of sentence that comes automatically when you've spent a lifetime managing how information lands. Then he left it where it was. No, he said again. I'm not surprised. Amani nodded slowly, like she was confirming something she'd already decided. I've been trying to figure out for a while now, she said. Whether you didn't see it or didn't want to see it. Could never land on which one both, Dominic said. At different times. She looked at him. He kept going, because stopping now would be the same as lying. When you first told me 3 years in, maybe 4, I thought you were reading into things. My mother is a difficult woman. That's real. That's not something I invented to dismiss you. She's difficult with everyone. She's not difficult with everyone the same way. No, he said. She's not. Amani wrapped both hands tighter around the mug. Your cousin Marco brought a girlfriend to Christmas dinner 4 years ago. Your mother didn't like her either. She was rude to her twice. You said something to Marco about it that same night I heard you. You told him his mother shouldn't talk to his girlfriend that way. Dominic was quiet. You never said that to your mother about me, Amani said. Not once in 9 years. The radiator knocked in the hallway upstairs. Once. Like punctuation. He couldn't find anything to say to that because she was right. And every explanation he could construct for it collapsed under the weight of what she just said. He had seen his aunt be dismissive to Marco's girlfriend and responded that same evening. He had watched his wife come home from his mother's house with that particular tired expression for nearly a decade and told her she was too sensitive. Protected her, he said, and hated how it sounded coming out of his mouth. Not consciously. I don't think I sat down and decided, but that's what I was doing. Amani looked at the table, then back at him. I know you weren't doing it on purpose. That's almost the harder part. Why? Because if you'd done it on purpose, I could be angry at you for a specific decision. This way I have to be angry at a habit. Something you didn't even know you were doing while you were doing it. She stopped, pressed her lips together. That's a lonelier kind of wrong to live with. He felt that sentence go into him and stay. She wasn't performing this. Amani didn't perform. He had been with women in his life before her who were talented at performing emotion manufacturing tears at the right moment, calibrating displays of hurt for maximum effect. Amani had none of that machinery. When she spoke, it came out exactly as it was, which meant it arrived without cushioning and landed exactly as hard as it was supposed to. How many times? He asked. She looked at him. How many times did she do something like tonight? Not the envelope, I mean. I know what you mean. Amani was quiet for a moment. I stopped counting around year 4. He breathed out slowly. It wasn't always money or ultimatums. Most of the time it was smaller. The way she looked at me when I walked in a room. The things she said about Baltimore when she thought she was being sympathetic. Oh, Imani, you've done so well for yourself, considering. The way she talked about Micah's future and somehow managed to talk about it for 20 minutes without ever really including me in the picture. She paused. The women she mentioned. It wasn't just Bianca. There were others over the years. All of them mentioned casually, always with some specific thing she wanted me to notice bits. This one speaks Italian. This one's family has been with the Ravellos for 30 years. This one understands the life. Imani, I'm not asking you to feel worse, she said, cutting him off cleanly. I'm answering your question. You asked how many times. The answer is enough times that when she had that envelope on the table today, my first feeling wasn't shock. It was something more like, oh, so we're finally here. Dominic put his elbows on the island and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He sat like that for a few seconds. Then he lowered his hands and looked at her. I should have been there. Yes. Not tonight specifically. I mean, I know what you mean, she said again. You should have been there every time I came home and tried to explain what was happening. You should have been there instead of telling me your mother was just that way. What can I do? He said. Tell me what I can actually do. She looked at him with an expression he recognized, but couldn't name. Not cold, not warm. Somewhere in the specific territory of a person's who's been asked that question before and is deciding whether this time is different. I don't know yet, she said. She picked up her mug, finally, and drank. He sat with that answer and didn't push past it, because pushing past it was what he would have done before tonight, and before tonight had gotten them here. 3 days passed in the house, with the specific quality of water that looks still and isn't. They were not fighting. That was perhaps the strangest part. Dominic had expected something to crack open after that night in the kitchen, some argument that would at least have the dignity of noise. Instead, they moved around each other with a careful courtesy that was in some ways more unsettling than an argument would have been. He made breakfast. She got Micah ready for school. They sat at the same table. They talked about normal things in the careful way of people navigating a floor they're not sure will hold weight. Micah, with the radar of children who know more than they're supposed to, was quieter than usual. He still laughed. He still wanted the remote-controlled car running the length of the kitchen floor 3 times after dinner. He still asked his father to read to him at night. But there were moments when he looked between his parents with something in his eyes that was too old for 7, a watchfulness that shouldn't have been there yet. And Dominic noticed, and the noticing of it made something in his chest ache specifically. On the 3rd day, his phone rang. He was in his office in the back of the house, a room Amani called the submarine, because it had no windows, and he went in there and sealed the door and emerged hours later with no explanation of what had occurred in the meantime. He looked at the caller ID, and something settled in his gut. He picked up. His mother's voice was different than it had been in the drawing room. Not softer exactly. Recalibrated. She had taken 3 days to decide which version of Serafina Ravello would be most effective in this phone call, and had landed on something that sounded almost like concern. Dominic, we need to talk about what happened. We don't, he said. A pause, you're being dramatic. I'm not. I did what I did because I love you. Because I have spent... Stop, he said. Not loudly. Just fully. Whatever version of this you've been preparing for 3 days, you can put it away. I'm not interested in your explanation. Another pause. Longer. I am your mother. I know who you are. Then you understand that everything I do for this family. For what your father built. You think I wanted. You put a price on my wife in our family's house, he said, in front of my son. You brought another woman to the table, so my wife would understand what you thought she was replaceable with. That's what you did. I don't need you to explain to me why you thought that was love. I know you think it was love. That's the part I can't get past. Serafina was quiet. I heard everything, he said. I was in the hallway. I heard you tell her she was never worthy of the Ravello name. I heard you tell her Micah deserves better than her world. I heard what you said about where she grew up. I have known my mother my whole life, and I know the difference between your careless words and your deliberate ones, and none of what you said to her yesterday was careless. Dominic, she tried to tell me, for years. I told her she was misreading you. His voice didn't change. It stayed level, which was somehow colder than volume would have been. I made her prove something that didn't require proof. That's on me. But what you put her through every dinner, every visit, every comparison, that's on you. And you don't get to call me dramatic for not wanting to hear an explanation for it. His mother's voice shifted. The concerned version of Serafina exited, and something older came in. Harder. He knew this voice too. He'd heard it used on contractors, on rivals, on people who thought they could navigate her with more skill than they had. You're choosing a woman over your family. I'm choosing my wife over your comfort, he said. Those aren't the same thing. Your father would... My father is not here, he said, and meant it as a statement of fact, not cruelty, though he knew it landed as both. The line was quiet for long enough that he thought she might have ended the call. Then I still hold the Carlotti accounts. The restaurant licenses through my name. The property in Westchester. Your father structured it that way, on purpose, to keep the family together. If you're going to... I know what you hold, he said. Then you know what this means if you don't come back to the table. He leaned back in his chair. The leather made a small sound. He looked at the ceiling of his windowless office and thought, very briefly, of his father, not the romantic version, not the legacy version that Serafina had been polishing for 15 years, but the actual man. Luca Ravello, who had been brilliant and ruthless, and also, privately, a little afraid of his wife, who had structured his estate in a way that kept Serafina relevant, because relevance was the only peace offering that worked. Then you use it, Dominic said, if that's what you decide to do. You'd let me burn 30 years of your father's work. You'd let me lose my marriage should protect it, he said. So I guess we'll see which one of us means it. He ended the call. He sat in the submarine with the phone on the desk, and his hands flat on the surface, and breathed in through his nose for a count of 4, the way he'd learned to do in rooms where he couldn't show anything on his face. Then he picked up the phone again and called his lawyer. Amani found out about the Serafina call 2 days later. Not from Dominic, but from his cousin Angela, who called Amani directly on a Tuesday afternoon while Amani was picking up Micah from school. Angela was the family member Imani trusted most, or had, before she'd stopped trusting the family as a unit and started evaluating each member individually. Angela was 40 sharp and had the specific quality of a woman who had watched her family do things she didn't agree with for long enough that she had no patience left for the decorative versions of events. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what you're walking into," Angela said without preamble. "Serafina is calling people. She's not calling them about Dominic, calling them about you." Amani stood on the sidewalk outside Micah's school with the phone to her ear and watched a group of second graders file out, looking for her son's face. "What is she saying?" "That you've been working against the family. That you encouraged Dominic to pull back from certain relationships. That you're isolating him." Angela paused. "She's being careful with it. She's not saying anything specific enough to grab onto. Just enough to plant the idea that you're a problem. She's been doing a version of that for years." "I know. But she's doing it louder now. And she's doing it with people who have money in Dominic's operations." Another pause. "Imani, I love my aunt. I'm not doing this to create drama. I'm doing this because she's scared, and scared Serafina is more dangerous than the regular kind. And you need to know what the temperature is out there." Micah appeared in the doorway, backpack too big for his frame, scanning for his mother. He saw her and raised his hand in a wave that was entirely unself-conscious. The pure wave of a child who hasn't learned yet to be cool about loving their parents in public. She raised her hand back, kept the phone to her ear. "Thank you," she said to Angela. "I mean it." After she ended the call, she stood on the sidewalk for another 10 seconds, with Micah walking toward her across the concrete and the October cold picking up, and Angela's words sitting in her chest like stones she was going to have to carry now, in addition to everything else. She smiled when Micah reached her, took his backpack from him, because she always took his backpack from him. That was their thing. He handed it off, and she took the weight of it. "Good day," she asked. "We did fractions," Micah said. "I don't understand why there are so many numbers." "There really are a lot of them," she agreed. He took her hand as they walked to the car, and she held it, and she did not think about Serafina for the next 4 hours, because she refused to let that woman have the hours that belonged to her son. That night, after Micah was in bed, she told Dominic about Angela's call. She told him factually, without editorializing. What Angela said, who Serafina was calling, what she was telling them. She watched his face as she spoke and saw a series of small things move through his expression. She had gotten better over the years at reading him, which was something you had to develop with a man who had trained himself not to be readable. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "My lawyer told me. She's already made 4 calls. Carlotti people, 2 of the license holders, and Giordano." He said Giordano's name in the specific flat tone he used, for people he didn't like but had to deal with. "She's not doing anything actionable yet. She's seeding." "What does that mean for you?" "It means I need to move some things before she does." He rubbed his jaw. "I've already started. The Westchester property is straightforward. The restaurant licenses are more complicated, but not impossible. The Carlotti connection is the one that takes time." "How much time?" 6 months. "Maybe 8. And in those 6 to 8 months?" He looked at her directly. "She can do damage. I won't pretend she can't." Amani processed that. She was sitting in the chair by the window, legs tucked under her, and she was not performing calm. She actually was calm, which sometimes alarmed her, the way she could receive genuinely terrible information and stay level. She had been doing it for years. It was a survival mechanism she had developed so slowly, she hadn't noticed it becoming permanent. "What I need to know," she said, "is whether you're moving those things because you want to protect your marriage, or because she attacked your operations. And this is a professional response." He looked at her, like the question had caught him somewhere uncomfortable. "Because those aren't the same thing," she continued. "And I need to know which one I'm actually living inside." He didn't answer immediately. She appreciated that he didn't answer immediately. An immediate answer would have been the professional Dominic, the man who knew how to construct the right sentence. The delay meant he was trying to tell her the truth. Both, he finally said. It started as professional. The moment she mentioned the accounts on the phone, the operational part of my brain activated. And that's real. I can't pretend it's not. He leaned forward on the couch, elbows on his knees. But the reason I called my lawyer, before she finished the sentence, the reason I didn't need to think about it, is because the alternative was letting her win. And her winning means you lose. And that's not something I'm willing to be part of anymore. Imani held his gaze. I believe you, she said. Okay. I also need you to understand something. She unfolded her legs and sat up straighter. I've been here 9 years. I built a life here, with you, in this world that has nothing to do with where I came from. And I did that because I love you, and because I believed in what we were making. But I am not able to do 9 more years of being something your family has to be managed around. Can't do that. I'm not asking you to. I need to hear what you're actually planning, he told her. It took about 20 minutes and was specific and practical in the way that Dominic was specific and practical when he was not performing anything the precise reorganization of accounts. The legal documentation that would remove Serafina's leverage over their household finances. The conversation he intended to have with his operations that would make his position unambiguous. He didn't make it sound easy. He didn't promise her a timeline that wasn't realistic. She listened to all of it. Then she said, and your relationship with her? He looked at the floor for a moment, then up, severed, until she can stand in front of you and take responsibility for what she did. Not a performance of an apology. Responsibility. You understand she may never do that. Yes, that could be permanent, I know. Imani studied his face for a long time. She was looking for the thing that would tell her this was the wrong version, the version that sounded right and wasn't, the version she'd received before on smaller things and been wrong about. She was trying to read him with every tool she had. She found what she was looking for finally in the thing that wasn't there. He wasn't asking her to make it easier for him. Every time before, every time he'd told her his mother was just difficult, just that way, just one of her generation, there had been a article underneath it of asking Imani to let it go so he didn't have to deal with it. She had always sensed that and had told herself she was being uncharitable. She wasn't being uncharitable. She had been reading him accurately the whole time. That quality was absent tonight. He wasn't asking her for an easier version of this. He was sitting in the hard version, without requesting relief from it. Okay, she said. He looked at her. I'm not saying everything is fixed, she said. I'm saying, okay, I hear you, we keep going. He nodded. Neither of them moved toward each other, and neither of them moved away. The call came at 11:47 on a Thursday night. Dominic was still awake. He slept badly at the best of times, and these were not the best of times sitting in the kitchen with a glass of water. He wasn't drinking when his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Then he did. The man on the other end introduced himself as Paul Giordano, not the senior Giordano the son, about Dominic's age, who had inherited his father's position in the family network 6 years ago and had spent most of those 6 years being professionally cordial with Dominic in the cautious way of two people who needed each other and didn't fully trust each other, which was the most common kind of working relationship in Dominic's world. I want to be straight with you, Paul said. Your mother called me 10 days ago. I know, a beat. Then you know what she said. I know the outline. You can give me specifics if you want to. Paul was quiet for a second. She told me your wife has been a destabilizing influence, that she's been pulling you away from long-standing relationships for personal reasons. She asked me to be careful about expanding our arrangement. What did you tell her? I told her I'd think about it. Another pause. I've thought about it. Dominic waited. My mother died 4 years ago, Paul said. Ovarian cancer. It went fast. My father remarried 8 months after. I watched my mother's family, her sisters, her cousins. I watched them go after my stepmother in ways that I wouldn't do to someone I hated, because my father loved her. That was enough for them. Paul's voice was steady and quiet. Promised myself I wouldn't be part of that kind of thing. Dominic held the phone. Didn't say anything. Your wife isn't the problem Serafina is describing, Paul said. And I think you know that. I'm calling because I think you deserve to know she's moving faster than you might expect. What do you mean faster? Paul told him. And as he listened, standing in his kitchen in the quiet of nearly midnight, Dominic felt the specific sensation of ground shifting under his feet, not metaphorically, but in the physical way, the way his body processed threat before his mind caught up. His mother had not stopped phone calls. She had already made a move on 2 accounts that Dominic had assumed were protected by the structure of their existing arrangement. Small moves, preliminary, but deliberate. She was not waiting to see if he came back to the table. She was acting as if he wasn't coming back and building the version of the landscape where she had already won. "Thank you," Dominic said to Paul. "I'm not asking for anything," Paul said. "I know. That's why I'm thanking you." After the call, Dominic stood in the kitchen for a long moment with the phone face down on the counter. His mother had moved. She had decided that the version of events where Dominic simply stood in her drawing room and said his piece and went home was not the ending, it was the intermission. She had spent 3 days making calls, 10 more days making preliminary moves, and she had done all of this while Dominic was working through the careful domestic geometry of rebuilding trust with his wife, and he now understood slightly too slow. He was not panicked. Panic was not something he had experienced in a professional context since he was 22. What he felt instead was a cold, specific clarity. The kind that came in rooms where the situation had clarified itself, and all the ambiguity was gone, and what remained was just the problem and the response. His mother had turned this into a war. She had decided that if he wouldn't choose her, she would make the choice unavoidable. She would remove enough of the structural ground under his operations that coming back to her became the only rational option. She thought she understood how his mind worked. She had, after all, watched him operate for 15 years. She thought she knew what he would protect when things became genuinely costly. She had miscalculated. Not on the finances. Her moves there were intelligent, and she wasn't wrong about the leverage. She had miscalculated on what Dominic was protecting now. He walked to the stairs. He went up to the 2nd floor, past Micah's room where the nightlight made the crack under the door, glow faint orange. He stood outside his own bedroom door with his hand on the frame. Inside, Amani was asleep. He had watched her sleep thousands of times. She slept on her left side, with one hand tucked under the pillow, and she had done this since the first morning he'd woken up beside her and found her already arranged this way, self-contained even in sleep, not needing anything from the space around her. She had been fighting his family alone for 9 years. She had raised their son in the middle of a war she was never supposed to know was happening. She had stayed because she loved him, and he had spent years treating that love like something with unlimited credit drawing on it, without ever checking the balance, assuming it would be there because it always had been. He had one chance to not be that man anymore. And his mother, in her calculation, had forgotten to account for what a man will do when he finally understands what he has actually been protecting all along. He went back downstairs. He called his lawyer at midnight, and she answered on the 2nd ring because she was paid to answer on the 2nd ring, and he told her to begin accelerating the timeline on everything. Then he sat down in the kitchen and began to plan. Not a defensive plan, not the plan of a man managing damage, plan of a man who had decided, and in the silence of that kitchen, with his wife asleep upstairs, and his son dreaming in the orange nightlight glow, and his mother somewhere in Connecticut, convinced she had already written the ending of this story, Dominic Ravello made a decision that there was no walking back from. Some decisions feel like doors closing. This one felt like the whole building. The lawyer's name was Carla Messina, and she had been handling Dominic's legal affairs for 11 years, which meant she had seen things that would have ended most careers in her profession, and she had filed them away in the particular internal archive that good lawyers develop, not forgotten, not discussed, simply stored behind a door that stayed locked, unless the situation required otherwise. She called him back at 7:45 the next morning, while he was standing in the kitchen making Micah's lunch. Peanut butter, no jelly. Crust cut off, which Micah had required since he was 4, and which Dominic did without thinking now, his hands moving through the familiar mechanics, while his mind was already somewhere else. "I need you in my office at 10, Carla said. In person, not the phone. He knew what that meant. There were things Carla would say over a secured line, and things she wouldn't. And the things she wouldn't were always the things that required sitting across a desk from him so she could watch his face. "I'll be there," he said. He finished the sandwich, cut it diagonally, not straight across. Micah had informed him 8 months ago, with the gravity of a person delivering a significant policy change, that diagonal was better. Dominic had switched and never gone back. He heard Amani's footsteps on the stairs, her particular rhythm, slightly heavier on the left foot, from an old ankle injury she'd gotten in college that never fully healed. He knew her footsteps the way he knew his own breathing. She came into the kitchen, looked at him, looked at the phone face up on the counter, and said nothing. She was good at reading rooms. She was good at reading him, better than he'd ever given her credit for when he'd had the luxury of not thinking about it. Lawyer, he said. Poured herself coffee. How bad? Don't know yet. Going in at 10. She took her coffee and sat at the island, and they existed together in the kitchen, while Micah came downstairs in his school clothes, but with his shirt on backwards, which neither of them pointed out for a solid 30 seconds, because they were both looking at and something in the normalcy of a 7-year-old in a backward shirt felt necessary to hold on to right now. Then Smani said, Micah, baby. He looked down, turned it around himself, already knowing, doing the full spin in place, that kids do when they correct something. Dominic caught himself almost smiling at it. He drove Micah to school himself that morning. He did this sometimes, when operations allowed, not often enough. He knew that, but enough that Micah didn't treat it as an event. They talked about fractions for 3 blocks, and then Micah said, without segue, the way children moved between subjects, is Grandma Serafina coming for Thanksgiving? Dominic kept his eyes on the road. I don't know yet, he said. Micah was quiet for a moment. She grabbed my arm, he said. It wasn't like a nice grab. Dominic's hands tightened on the wheel, then deliberately loosened. I know. That wasn't okay. Okay. Micah appeared to file this. Then, are you and Mom in a fight? No. You're doing the quiet thing. What quiet thing? When something's wrong, you both get quiet, but you're still nice. It's like quiet nice, instead of regular nice. Micah said this with the casual precision of a child who has been paying closer attention than anyone realized. I can tell. Dominic looked at his son in the rearview mirror. 7 years old and already reading rooms. We're working through some things, he said. Between adults. It has nothing to do with you. That's what people say when it has something to do with you. He didn't have an answer for that, because Micah was right, and lying to his son felt, at this particular moment, like something he actively couldn't do. We're okay, he said instead. I promise you that part. Micah looked out the window, accepted this. Then the car is really fast. Can we race it again tonight? Yeah, Dominic said. We can race it tonight. Carla Messina's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown that deliberately looked less expensive than it was. The furniture was good but not showy. The art was original but not recognizable. Everything in the space was calibrated to suggest a certain level of seriousness without advertising it, which was exactly the kind of environment Carla herself projected. She was 53, small, with reading glasses she pushed up onto her forehead when she wasn't using them. She stood when he came in, which she didn't always do, and that told him something before she said a word. She closed the door, sat, put a manila folder on the desk between them but didn't open it. I want to preface this by saying that what I'm about to show you is preliminary. My investigator had it at 2 in the morning, and I've been verifying since 5. Show me, she opened the folder. The documents were financial at first glance, account transfers dated over a 14-month period, amounts that ranged from modest to significant. He looked at the structure of them and identified the pattern inside about 40 seconds, because reading financial documents for embedded information was something he'd been doing since he was 23. The money was moving from one account through a series of intermediaries and landing somewhere that wasn't immediately obvious. What am I looking at, he said. Not because he didn't see it, because he wanted to hear her say it. Your mother has been moving funds, Carla said. Not from her personal accounts. From the operational pool she manages through the Carlotti arrangement. How long? 14 months. He looked up from the folder. The destination accounts are under a name I didn't recognize initially, Carla said. She pulled out a separate page. It took my investigator 6 hours to build the connection. She put the page on top of the folder. The name on the destination account was Marco Ravello, his cousin, the same cousin whose girlfriend Dominic had once defended at Christmas dinner. The same cousin he'd trusted with 3 specific distribution relationships in the Northeastern Territory. Cousin who had been at his wedding, who had held Micah the day he was born, standing in the hospital hallway in a shirt that was too big for him because he'd driven 4 hours without time to change. Dominic looked at the name for a long time. How much, he said. Carla told him. He looked back at the documents. The number was large enough to mean that this was not a sideline operation. This was not Marco putting aside a little money for a rainy day, skimming something small and hoping nobody looked closely. This was 14 months of deliberate, structured financial movement that required knowledge of the accounts, access to the transfer protocols, and a level of planning that meant someone had helped him set it up. Serafina, Dominic said. That's my read, Carla said. I can't prove it yet. The connection is indirect. But the timing aligns with her first outreach to the Carlotti group, and the access Marco would have needed, he wouldn't have had it without her. No. Dominic closed the folder. He sat back in the chair and looked at the wall behind Carla's desk, which had a painting on it abstract, dark blues and greens, something she'd mentioned once her daughter had made in college. He looked at it without seeing it. His mother had not simply made phone calls. She had not simply leveraged accounts and sent preliminary signals. She had, 14 months ago before the afternoon in the drawing room, before the envelope, before any of this was in the open, she had already been building the structure of a parallel operation. She had been using Marco, who was trusted and embedded and positioned, and she had been doing it in the 14 months since Dominic had told her. During one conversation he barely remembered now, that he was thinking about restructuring certain arrangements in a way that would reduce her direct involvement. One conversation 14 months ago, casual, a family dinner, half an aside. He had said something about wanting to simplify the structure. She had nodded and asked him to pass the bread, and then she had begun. She's been planning this longer than I have, he said, and his voice was completely flat. Yes, Carla said. Marco knows I'll find this. Eventually, yes. The question is whether he already knows you found it. Dominic picked up his phone. He looked at his recent calls. Marco had called him 4 days ago, a brief call, checking in, nothing unusual. The kind of call Marco made regularly enough that it didn't stand out. Dominic had called back. They'd talked for 6 minutes about something operational and unremarkable, and Marco had sounded exactly like Marco always sounded. He thought about that call now with a different filter. 6 minutes. Marco's voice relaxed. Easy, the same voice he'd had at every family dinner for 30 years. He was either unaware that Dominic might find it, or he was a significantly better performer than Dominic had given him credit for. I need to know if Marco moved anything in the last 72 hours, Dominic said. I'll have it by this afternoon. He stood up, put his hands in his pockets, stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the midtown street 14 floors below, where people moved in the collective rhythm of the city, everybody going somewhere, nobody looking up. If my mother built this 14 months ago, he said slowly, working through it, it means she wasn't responding to the drawing room. The drawing room was the end of something she'd already started. Carla said nothing, which was her version of agreement, when she didn't have enough to confirm. She decided a year ago that the marriage was the problem, Dominic said. She decided 14 months ago. And she started moving money with Marco as a contingency in case I didn't respond to the social pressure. He turned from the window. The phone calls, Bianca in that room, the envelope that was her first attempt. The friendly version, move my wife out of the picture through embarrassment and cash. That didn't work. The financial structure was already in place, Carla said. The full shape of it assembled itself in his mind. His mother hadn't lost her temper that afternoon in the drawing room. She hadn't acted impulsively. She hadn't been driven over some edge by years of frustration with Imani. She had sat down with a specific calculation and built 2 parallel paths, one financial, both aimed at the same destination. She had used Marco as a tool. She had positioned Bianca as a prop. She had assembled an envelope with cash and brought it to a marble table and delivered her speech, and none of it had been improvisation. Every word she'd said to Imani that afternoon had been the opening move in a structure she'd been building for over a year. Thought about Imani, about that afternoon. His wife holding their son against her hip, looking at an envelope of cash and at another woman across the table and at the architectural contempt of a person who had been planning her removal for 14 months. Something moved through Dominic that wasn't anger exactly. It was colder than anger and quieter. I need everything you can build, he said to Carla. Not for legal action. For protection. I need the picture to be complete before I move. How much time do I have? Days, he said, not weeks. He didn't go home immediately. He drove not with a destination, just moving, the city passing. He ended up parked on a block in Queens, not particularly close to anything meaningful, just a residential street, with a bodega on one corner and a nail salon on the other, and 3 trees still holding their October leaves between the parked cars. He sat in the car and called Marco. Marco answered on the second ring. Dom. What's up? Normal voice. Easy. The voice of a man who answers calls from his cousin without any particular alertness. Dominic said, "Are you in the city?" Jersey. I can come in. What do you need? Dinner tonight. My house. 8 o'clock. A brief pause. So brief, it was technically within the normal range of a person adjusting their evening plans. Yeah, sure. Everything okay? Yeah, Dominic said. I just want to catch up. Haven't seen you since... He let the sentence trail. Waited. Since before your trip, right? Marco said. Right, cool. 8 o'clock. You want me to bring anything? Just yourself. He ended the call and sat with the phone in his lap and thought about Marco at his wedding, standing next to him at the altar in a rented suit, making a toast afterward that had made Imani laugh until she had to put down her glass. 30 years. He picked up the phone again and called Imani. She answered quickly. Hey, how bad? He had to decide in real time how much to tell her. Not whether to tell her he had already made that commitment. He was not going back behind the glass on this. She deserved the complete information. Question was sequencing. The question was how much she needed to know right now, today, before he had the full picture, versus what he needed to confirm tonight. He made a decision. Bad, he said, but I need a few more hours before I have all of it. Tonight, I need to have a conversation with Marco. Silence on her end for 3 seconds. Marco, she said. Yes. Why Marco? Because his name showed up somewhere it shouldn't be. He heard her exhale. Slow. Processing. How long has his name been there? 14 months. The silence this time was longer. 14 months, she said, and the 2 words came out with a specific weight. He knew why. 14 months ago was around the time she had told him, during one of their harder conversations, that she felt like the family was closing ranks against her. He had told her she was reading into things. He had said that his family, whatever their flaws, ultimately supported their marriage. He had said that 14 months ago. Imani, she said, not angry, tired, the exhausted version of not. Don't explain it right now. Tonight after Marco, you tell me everything. Okay? Okay, is Micah safe? Yes, this doesn't touch Micah. Okay, a breath. Okay, I'll have food here. Come home before Marco comes so I can see your face first. He closed his eyes for a second, inside the parked car on a block in Queens. I will. Marco arrived at 8:12. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been handsome in his 20s and had settled into something more interesting in his 40s lived in, the lines around his eyes deep enough to read. He had a bottle of wine in his hand, red, the kind Dominic usually kept in the house, which meant Marco had picked specifically. He came in and hugged Dominic in the easy way of family who had known each other long enough to hug without thinking about it. He shook hands warmly when Imani came into the hallway, said something to her that made her give him a polite smile, the smile she used when she was managing a situation rather than responding to it. Dominic noticed Marco noticed the smile. They sat at the kitchen table. Imani had made food pasta, simple, the kind of thing that doesn't require a reason, and put it out, and then said she had things to do upstairs, which was the graceful exit she'd offered, and which both men understood. They ate for a few minutes. Marco talked about Jersey, about a problem with a supplier, about something his youngest daughter had done at school that was funny and small and normal. Dominic listened and responded at the right moments and watched Marco's face with the particular attention he had developed over years of reading people in rooms. Marco was good. He was very good. His breathing was even. His eye contact was comfortable without being deliberate. His body language was open, the way it always was. If there was a performance happening, it was one he had been practicing long enough that it had become second nature. Dominic poured more wine. I had a meeting with Carla yesterday, he said. Yeah? Marco twirled pasta. What's she working on? Cleanup. Mostly. Some restructuring I've been meaning to get to. Dominic kept his voice conversational. She found some irregular movement in the Carlotti pool. Marco's fork did not stop moving. He did not look up for a beat longer than normal. When he did look up, his expression was curious. What kind of irregular? 14 months of structured transfers, Dominic said, through a sequence of intermediaries, ending up in accounts under a name I recognized. The table was quiet. Marco put down his fork. He looked at Dominic, and in the specific quality of that look, not the guilt exactly, but the way the performance stopped, the way the easy family dinner face dissolved, and what replaced it was something older and more complicated in that. Dominic had his answer. Dom, Marco said. Don't, Dominic said. The single word landed the same way it had landed in Carla's office. Not aggressive, absolute. Marco sat back. He looked at the table. He looked at his wine. He looked at his hands, which were flat on the table now. Still. How long have you known? Marco said. Since yesterday morning. And you called me for dinner? Yes. Marco exhaled. A long breath, controlled. Like a man who has been holding something for a while and is letting it go in a managed way because unmanaged release is not something men like them do, even in private. She came to me 14 months ago, Marco said. Dominic waited. She said you were going to restructure the Northeastern Territory in a way that was going to create risk for everyone. She said she needed a safe path built, in case things went wrong. She said, he stopped, started again. She said Amani was going to take you somewhere you didn't understand yet, and she needed people who loved you to be in position to catch you when that happened. Dominic listened to this without expression. She said it like it was protection. Marco said, and his voice had shifted into something different now. Not defensive, not quite regretful, but something in the register of a man confronting the gap between what he'd told himself at the time and what it actually was. She made it sound like I'd be protecting you. You moved family money, Dominic said, into a structure she controls, for 14 months, without telling me. Marco had no answer for that phrasing. He looked at the table. I made a mistake, he said. You made a choice, Dominic said. For 14 months. I know. She told you this was for me. Yes, and you believed her. Marco looked up. She's your mother, Dom. I grew up in her house the same as you. He stopped. The sentence didn't have an end that held up, and he seemed to know it. She convinced you my wife was the problem, Dominic said. Silence. Didn't she? Marco pressed his lips together, said nothing, which was everything. Dominic sat with that for a moment. Picture assembling itself in full resolution. Now his mother, 14 months ago, working not just through accounts, but through people. Through Marco, who loved Dominic and trusted Serafina and had grown up in her house and had absorbed over a lifetime her version of what the Ravello family required. She had taken that love and that trust and that lifelong conditioning, and she had pointed them at his marriage like a weapon. Did she tell you what she was building it for? Dominic said. The destination of the money? The specific use? Marco was quiet for a long moment. She said it was a contingency, he said finally. In case you needed leverage. In case things deteriorated and you needed to negotiate from a position. Negotiate with who? Marco didn't answer. Dominic leaned forward slightly. Marco, negotiate with who? With Amani, Marco said, very quietly, in case there was a divorce. She wanted the structure in place so Amani couldn't, so the assets would be... He stopped. So the assets would be protected from a settlement. The kitchen was very quiet. Dominic heard the radiator upstairs, the knock in the hallway. Micah's nightlight faint through the ceiling. 14 months ago, while Amani had been here in this house, raising their son, waiting for him to come home from his trips, telling him at dinner that she felt like the family was closing in on her. Mabry, while she was living, that his mother and his cousin had been building a financial structure designed to strip her of what she was entitled to if their marriage ended. They had been preparing for the end of his marriage. They had been building the architecture of her loss. Before she had even been handed an envelope. Before Bianca had been brought to a table. Before any of it was visible. They had already been in the construction phase of removing her. He stood up from the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch Marco, didn't move toward him. He walked to the window over the signs and stood there with his hands on the edge of the counter and breathed. Marco said his name. Don't talk right now, Dominic said. Marco went quiet. He stood at the window for close to 2 minutes, long enough that the silence had its own weight. long enough that Marco behind him shifted in his chair once and then went still again. Then Dominic turned around. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to give Carla full access to everything you built. Every account, every transfer record, every communication with my mother about this. All of it." Marco nodded. "If I find out there's anything you didn't give her, we're done. Not the operation. Us. 30 years is over." Marco looked like he'd been struck. "Then quietly, I understand. Get out of my house." Marco stood. He put down his napkin. He picked up his jacket from the chair back, and he walked to the hallway, and he stopped there and turned back once with the expression of a man who wants to say something and knows there is nothing adequate to say, and so says nothing and goes. The front door closed. Dominic stood alone in his kitchen. He heard footsteps on the stairs on a specific rhythm, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway in the clothes she'd changed into after Marco arrived, holding a mug, looking at him with the expression he'd come to understand over the past 2 weeks, as her true face, not managed, not composed, just present and watchful, and telling him everything if he was finally willing to read it. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it. The 14 months, the accounts, Marco, the specific purpose, he said it plainly, without softening it, without finding a way to deliver it that made it easier to receive. She listened without moving from the doorway. When he finished, she was quiet. She looked at the table where Marco's wine glass was still there, with a half-inch of red at the bottom. "They were building for a divorce," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Before I was even given an envelope. Before any of this was open." "Yes," she made a sound. Not a word, a small involuntary sound that she suppressed almost immediately, the kind that escapes when something lands, somewhere too deep for managed response. She pressed her lips together, looked at the ceiling. The mug in her hands tilted slightly, and she corrected it without looking down. "How does it feel?" she said, very quietly. "To find out your family had a longer plan than you knew about?" He looked at her. "How does it feel?" she said again. "To trust the people around you and find out they were already 3 moves ahead of you?" He understood what she was doing, not punishing him, showing him, giving him a small door into what she had been living inside. For years, the sensation of discovering that what you thought was solid ground had been engineered beneath your feet by people who smiled at you across a dinner table. "It feels like the floor dropped," he said. "Yes," she said. "It does." She set the mug down on the counter. She crossed her arms over her chest, not closed off, holding herself together, which was different. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to think before you answer." "Okay. Is there anything else you haven't told me?" "Not because you're protecting me, not because you're managing the sequence. Is there any piece of this that I don't have yet?" Thought about it. Genuinely, without reflexively saying no. He ran through what Carla had told him, what Marco had confirmed, what he knew and what he was still building. "There may be more to what's in the accounts," he said. "Carla is still building the picture. But what I know right now, you know." She nodded slowly. "I'm not going to fall apart," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not. I'm tired, and I'm angry in a way that feels very quiet right now and probably won't stay quiet, but I'm not going to fall apart. I know you're not, but I need you to understand what this means to me to hear." She uncrossed her arms. 9 years ago, I married a man, and I walked into his family, and I tried to be a good wife and a good daughter-in-law and a good presence in that family's life. I didn't come from money. I didn't come from a name. I came from Baltimore, and I came from a working mother, and I came from myself. That was what I brought. Her voice stayed steady. "And your mother decided 14 months ago, maybe longer, that me and my Baltimore and my lack of a family name were such a threat to her son's empire that she built a financial structure to take away my ability to protect myself and my child if everything fell apart." She was not crying. That was the thing that went into him deepest. She was not crying. She was telling him the truth of what had been done to her with the level-specific clarity of a woman who has stopped hoping for a different reality and is simply looking at the one that exists. "She used my cousin to do it," Dominic said. "She used everything available to her," Amani said. "That's who she is. I tried to tell you who she was." "I know. I know you know." She picked up the mug again. "I'm going to go check on Micah, and then I'm going to sit in the bedroom, and I'm going to be angry privately for a while. And then tomorrow, I'm going to need to sit with Carla myself, Because if there's a structure designed to limit what I can do in a worst-case scenario, I need to understand it from someone who is working for me. Carla works for me. Then I need my own lawyer, she said. Simply. Not as a threat. As a woman who has just received information that makes independent legal representation a logical requirement. He said nothing. I'm not leaving, she said, reading his silence correctly. I'm protecting myself. Those are different things. You should understand the difference. I do, he said. She moved through the kitchen toward the hallway, stopped beside him. She didn't touch him, just stood close for a moment, looking up at him with those eyes that had been reading him for years with more accuracy than he deserved. You can't fix 14 months of this in 2 weeks, she said. I know, but you can keep going the direction you're going. I will. She moved past him toward the stairs. He stood in the kitchen alone and listened to her footsteps go up, past the radiator knock, toward their son's room. Outside, the city made its constant sound. Somewhere below, Marco was getting into his car. Somewhere in Connecticut, Serafina Ravello was in her mansion that had always stood and would outlast everyone in it. And she had built a 14-month structure designed to remove the woman who had just walked up the stairs of this house. And she had built it with family hands, and she had never once imagined that the thing that would undo her plan was not a counter-strategy or a legal filing or an operational move. It was a man who had finally decided to stop being useful to her version of events. Dominic opened the cabinet above the refrigerator. Kept one bottle of bourbon there, not for drinking regularly, for decisions. He poured 2 fingers and didn't drink it, just set the glass on the counter, and stood with his hands on either side of it. In the morning, Carla would send more documents. In the morning, Amani would call her own lawyer. In the morning, the structure his mother had spent 14 months building would begin to receive the full attention of a man who had built it once and knew every load-bearing wall. But tonight, standing in his kitchen with the bourbon untouched, and his wife upstairs and his son dreaming in orange light, Dominic Ravello understood something that no counter-strategy or legal filing could address. The most dangerous person in his family was not an enemy. She was his mother, and she had been preparing for this, longer than he had been willing to look. Poured the bourbon back into the bottle. He needed to be clear-headed for what came next, because what came next required him to dismantle something his mother had built, piece by piece over 14 months, using people who loved him as the materials, and he was going to have to be a different kind of man than he had ever been to do it, not harder, not colder, not more strategic. He was going to have to be someone who finished things not for the empire or the name or the legacy his father left, and his mother had been guarding like a weapon. He was going to have to finish this for the woman upstairs, who had come into his family with nothing but herself, and had been told, in 14 months of silent construction, that herself was not enough to be protected. He turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, he stood for one moment at the bottom of his own stairs, listening to the house, the radiator, the city, the specific silence of a sleeping child, and he made himself hold every piece of what he now knew, without flinching from any of it, and let it change him into whatever he needed to become. Then he went upstairs to his wife. He didn't sleep, not really. He lay on his side of the bed in the dark and listened to Amani breathe and watched the ceiling, and his mind ran the way it ran when he was in the middle of something that had no clean edges, not linear, not organized. Just turning the same information over and over at different angles, looking for the thing he hadn't seen yet. At 4:17 he got up. He didn't turn on lights. He moved through the house in the dark, the way he always did when he couldn't sleep, by memory and muscle, down the stairs, through the kitchen, to his office where he closed the door and turned on the single desk lamp and sat in the chair that had been his father's before it was his. He opened his laptop. Carla had sent 3 documents at 2 in the morning. She kept the hours of a person who had long ago made peace with the fact that her professional life didn't observe daylight. He read through all 3 carefully. Then he read them again. Then he sat back and looked at the wall. The picture was complete now, or complete enough. His mother had built the structure in phases. The first phase was Marco, and the accounts 14 months ago, right after that dinner conversation, she had begun moving money through Marco into a separate holding arrangement that was technically clean on paper, but functionally a war chest. Not for Serafina's use directly, for leverage, for the specific kind of leverage you needed when a divorce proceeding involved a man with Dominic's level of assets, the kind that could make discovery very complicated, and a settlement very unfavorable to the person without the financial architecture. The second phase was the social campaign. The years of Bianca, of comparisons, of quiet racially loaded insults, of envelope cash and arranged meetings. That was pressure. That was the part designed to make Imani leave voluntarily, which would have made the legal structure unnecessary. When that failed, when Imani stayed, and when Dominic had walked through that door, the third phase had been activated. The phone calls, the seeding, the acceleration of the financial moves that Paul Giordano had warned him about. His mother had shifted from social pressure to operational war. She had done all of this systematically. Over 14 months of groundwork and years of social preparation before that. She had been patient in the way of people who are absolutely certain they will eventually get what they want. Dominic sat in his father's chair and thought about his father. Luca Ravello had been a specific kind of man, brilliant at construction, at building things that lasted, at identifying what other people wanted and making himself necessary to its acquisition. He had built the network. He had built the name. He had built the estate structure that currently gave Serafina her leverage. He had also been afraid of his wife in the specific way of men who have never fully understood the thing they married. Luca had loved Serafina. Dominic had watched that love for 30 years and understood now, in this desk chair at 4 in the morning, that his father's love had included a permanent accommodation of Serafina's nature. A decision to manage around it rather than address it, because addressing it were changing the architecture of the entire marriage. His father had made his choice. Dominic had been making the same choice, with the same woman, for 9 years. He'd inherited the pattern as naturally as the signet ring. He picked up his phone and sent Carla one message. I need the full restructuring ready to execute by Friday. All of it. Whatever it takes. She replied in 4 minutes with a single word. Understood. He closed the laptop and sat in the quiet until he heard Micah's alarm go off upstairs at 7, the sound of some animated theme song that Micah had chosen himself and that played every morning with what Dominic privately considered unreasonable enthusiasm for that hour, and he stood up from his father's chair and went to make breakfast. Call from Serafina came at 9:43. While Dominic was driving back from dropping Micah at school, he let it ring. She called again at 9:48. He pulled over on a side street in Carroll Gardens and answered on the 5th ring of the second call, which was the length of time it took him to decide he was ready. Dominic. Her voice was different from all previous versions. Not the warmth she'd deployed in the drawing room, not the careful concern of the first post-confrontation call, not the hard threat of the accounts conversation. This was something stripped of performance. I know you found the accounts. He said nothing. Marco called me last night, she said. I assumed he would. Then you know I'm not calling to pretend. What are you calling for? A pause. To talk to you before this goes somewhere neither of us can take back. It's already there, he said. Dominic, you built a financial structure to strip my wife of her legal protections in a divorce proceeding, he said, not loudly, just clearly. You did it 14 months ago. You used my cousin. You have been running a campaign against my marriage for over a year while I was in my own house, telling my wife she was misreading you. Silence from her end. I want to know one thing, he said. One answer, honestly. Did you start the account structure before or after she told me at dinner that she felt like the family was closing in on her? The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. After Serafina said, he closed his eyes, opened them, watched a pigeon on the sidewalk outside his windshield navigate around a paper coffee cup. She told me that, he said. She sat across from me at my own table and told me exactly what was happening. And I told her she was being sensitive. His voice didn't crack. It just went very flat. And you heard that conversation. And 2 weeks later you went to Marco. Serafina said, I was protecting. Don't. The word came out with a force that he didn't try to control. You are not permitted to use that word to me about this. Not after 14 months of what you built. She was quiet again. Then I want to meet in person. Just the two of us. No, Dominic, not without Imani. The pause was very long. You want me to meet with her. I want you to meet with both of us. The same room. No attorneys, no money, no other people. If you have anything to say that isn't through a lawyer or through a phone call, You say it to both of us. That's the only meeting I'm willing to have. He could hear her breathing, controlled and deliberate, the way she'd breathed his entire life when she was containing something. All right, she said finally. He told her when and where. Then he ended the call and sat on the side street in Carroll Gardens until his hands, which he hadn't noticed, had been gripping the steering wheel, loosened. He told Amani that evening. She was folding laundry at the kitchen table, not because they didn't have people who could do that, but because Amani folded laundry when she needed something physical and methodical to do with her hands. He had learned this about her around year 3. She agreed to the meeting, he said. Amani folded a shirt, aligned the sleeves, set it on the stack. When? Saturday. The place I mentioned on the phone, neutral, public enough that nobody performs too hard. She picked up another shirt. And you think she'll actually say something real? I think she's scared, he said. I think for the first time in a very long time she doesn't know what the outcome is going to be. And Serafina doesn't operate well without a known outcome. Amani folded the shirt, set it down, looked at him. I need you to understand something about Saturday. Tell me. I'm not going to that meeting to reconcile. I'm not going to sit across from her and find a way to make it workable again. I went 9 years trying to make it workable. She pressed her palms flat on the stack of folded clothes. I'm going because I want her to say it to my face. Not to you through a phone call, not in a lawyer's document, not through Marco or anyone else. I want her to sit across from me and say what she did. And if she doesn't, then I'll know exactly what I'm dealing with for the rest of my life, and I'll make my decisions accordingly. She picked up the stack and moved it to the counter. But I think she will. I think she's exactly the kind of woman who, when she has no other options, will say the thing she's been refusing to say. Because in her mind, it's still a move. Even an apology is a move with her. He looked at his wife. You've been reading her longer than I have, he said. I've had to, she said. Friday arrived, and with it Carla's documents. Dominic spent 6 hours in the office. Not the submarine at home Carla's office. The 14th floor. The dark blues and greens of her daughter's painting on the wall. They went through everything line by line. The restructuring was complex in the way that any disentanglement of interwoven finances is complex things that had been built together over years don't come apart cleanly. There are always load-bearing connections that aren't obvious until you start removing material. By 2 in the afternoon, they had a structure. By 4, they had the documents ready to execute. By 5, he had signed everything that could be signed before Monday, and the things that required additional steps had their steps clearly mapped. He drove home in the Friday evening traffic that turned a 30-minute drive into 55 minutes, and he sat in the stop-and-go on the BQE and felt the specific exhaustion of a man who has been running on focus and adrenaline for 2 weeks and can feel the moment approaching where those resources are going to run out. His phone lit up. Not a call, a message from a number he didn't recognize. He glanced at it at a red light and felt something cold move through him. The message was 3 words. She found Marco. He called the number immediately. It rang twice and went to voicemail, a generic recording, no name. He called Marco directly. Marco answered in 2 rings. His voice was different from 2 nights ago, tighter, the easy quality completely gone. She called me this morning, Marco said without preamble. She knows you signed documents yesterday. How? I don't know. She knows, Dom. She called me and he stopped. Started again. She told me that if I give Carla access to the account records, she'll make sure Giordano knows I was the one who skimmed from the Northeastern Territory pool 4 years ago. Dominic went very still at the wheel. You skimmed from the Northeastern pool, he said. It was 4 years ago. It was a bad year. I put it back most of it. Marco's voice had the quality of a man who knows he's running out of ground. She knows because she's the one who told me how to structure it so it wouldn't show. She helped me hide it. The traffic moved. Dominic moved with it. Automatic. His foot on the gas and his mind somewhere outside the car entirely. His mother had helped Marco hide a theft from Dominic's own operations. 4 years ago. She had the information. She had helped conceal it. And she had held it for 4 years as a weapon she could deploy against Marco if she ever needed his cooperation withdrawn. She hadn't been building leverage for 14 months. She had been building it for at least 4 years. Marco was not a plan B. Marco had been a controlled asset for years before she ever activated him. How much did you skim, Dominic said. Marco told him. It was not small. It was not the number of a man having a bad year. It was the number of a man who had made a decision and then made it again and again before stopping, and who had been allowed to conceal it by a woman who understood that a secret shared is not a confidence but a leash. She owns you, Dominic said. Marco said nothing. She has owned you for 4 years, and you let her use that to involve you in what she built against my wife. Dom, I'm not asking you to explain it. His voice was very controlled and very cold. I'm telling you what it is. She owns you, and she just reminded you of that. Silence. What are you going to do? Marco said. Dominic thought for 3 seconds. I'm going to handle the theft. Between us, separate from everything else, with terms we negotiate through Carla after Saturday. You give Carla full access to everything related to my mother's structure by tomorrow morning. In exchange for that cooperation, the Northeastern matter gets handled privately, and if she goes to Giordano anyway, then I handle Giordano, Dominic said. That's my problem. Your problem is then I'm giving you one chance to stop being a tool in someone else's plan. A long pause. Okay, Marco said, quietly, like a man who has been carrying something heavy and has been given permission to set it down in exchange for something that will hurt but is cleaner than what he's been doing. Dominic ended the call. He drove the rest of the way home in traffic that didn't move, and he sat in it and let the full scope of what his mother had built assemble itself one final time in his mind. 4 years minimum, possibly longer. A structure of controlled information and leveraged relationships built inside the architecture of his own family, using people who loved him, aimed at protecting an empire from the woman he had chosen to share his life with. She had been more patient than he had ever given her credit for. She had also, in her patience, made one error. She had built everything on the assumption that Dominic would always ultimately prioritize the operation. The money, the name, the legacy, the machinery his father had built. She had structured her leverage around what she was certain he would protect when the situation became genuinely costly. She didn't know yet that he had spent 2 weeks rearranging what he was protecting. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of November day that didn't commit to rain but held the threat of it in the low ceiling of clouds that turned the city colorless. Imani was ready before him. She was sitting at the kitchen table when he came downstairs, dressed simply dark clothes, no jewelry except her wedding ring, which she wore every day but which he noticed specifically this morning. Her hands were around her coffee mug. Her back was straight. She looked like someone who had already had the hard part of this day in her own head and had come through it and was now just waiting for the external version to catch up. He made coffee, stood at the counter. "How are you doing?" he said. "I'm okay." A pause. "I didn't sleep great. Me either." "Are you ready for this?" He thought about the honest answer. "Ready isn't the right word. I know what I'm going in there to do." She looked at her coffee. She's going to try something. Even in that room, with no attorneys and no money, she's going to try something. I want you to be prepared for that. I know, and I need you to let me speak.
She looked up.
I need you to not step in front of it. Even if what she says is hard, I need to be the one who responds. I know that too. She studied his face for a moment. Then she nodded once and stood up and rinsed her mug and put it in the sink and picked up her coat from the chair. "Then let's go," she said. The restaurant was in Midtown, the kind of place that existed between expense account lunches and unhurried weekend brunches, tables far enough apart for conversation, noise level, consistent enough to provide cover, anonymous enough that nobody was going to recognize anyone or care if they did. Dominic had used it before for conversations he needed to have without an audience. He arrived first and chose the table himself, a corner placement with sightlines to both entrances. Habit. He didn't fight it anymore. Imani sat across from him. She set her coat on the chair beside her and folded her hands on the table and looked at the entrance. Serafina arrived 7 minutes after they did. She came in without hesitation, not the studied entrance of someone performing confidence, but the actual movement of a woman who had been walking into rooms as the most important person in them for 60 years, and whose body had never learned another way. She wore black, which she always did in winter. Her hair was perfectly done. Her posture was, as it always was, the posture of someone who had made a deliberate decision about her spine decades ago and never renegotiated. She saw them. She walked to the table. She did not look at Imani first. She looked at Dominic, and in that look was 40 years of accumulated mother and son communication, an entire private language that Dominic had spoken his whole life without being aware of it as a language. He did not respond to it. He pulled out the chair across from Imani and waited. Serafina sat. They were arranged in a triangle. Dominic at one side, Imani at another, Serafina at the third. The server came. They ordered coffee. Dominic ordered water. The server left. The ambient noise of the restaurant moved around them, warm and irrelevant. Serafina looked at Imani. It was the first time they had been in the same space since the drawing room. The look between them carried on everything from that afternoon's before, and all the years before it, and it was not comfortable, and Serafina did not attempt to make it comfortable. "I'll say what I came to say," Serafina said. Her voice was even. "Then you can say what you need to say." Imani didn't move. "Go ahead." Serafina placed her hands on the table, looked at them for a moment, then up. "I have spent 35 years running a family. Before that, I spent my childhood watching my mother run one. I learned that the family was the most important thing. Not individual members, the family as a structure, as a name, as a living thing that survived individual people. I'm not here for history," Imani said. Serafina paused, then continued. "What I did was wrong." The sentence came out like it cost something not staged, not performed, just the specific difficulty of a person saying 3 words they have been reorganizing themselves around for weeks. "What I did to you was wrong. The things I said in that room, the envelope, bringing Bianca there, that was..." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "That was cruel." The table was quiet. Dominic watched Imani's face. She hadn't moved. "And the accounts," Serafina said more quietly. "The structure with Marco, that was..." She looked at Dominic now. "I told myself it was protection. For the family. For you. I knew when I was building it what I was actually doing, and I told myself a different story." "What were you actually doing?" Imani said. Serafina looked back at her. "I was trying to make sure that if you left with as little as possible. I wanted it to cost you. For taking him away from what I thought he was supposed to be." The ambient restaurant noise continued. Somewhere nearby, a couple laughed at something. A glass clinked. "You thought I was taking him away," Imani said. "Yes." "From what?" "From the life he was raised for. From the world I built him for." Serafina's voice didn't waver, which was almost more disturbing than if it had. "I was wrong about that. I know that now. But that was what I thought. That you were redirecting him. Away from what his father built." "I wasn't redirecting him," Imani said. "I was married to him. I know, I was raising his son. I know. I was in your family's house for 9 years, trying to be a member of it, and you spent those 9 years, and apparently 4 years of planning before them, trying to make sure I never felt like one." Imani's voice was still level, still controlled. What's happening under it, not the surface level of the words, but the deeper register. The one that came from a place too old and too real to manage completely. "Do you have any idea what it is to sit at someone's dinner table and know the person across from you is looking at you and seeing a problem?" Serafina said nothing. "Do you know what it does to a person to go home to their husband and try to describe that feeling and have him tell them they're misreading it? For years?" Imani leaned forward slightly. "I started to believe I was wrong. I started to believe maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was seeing things that weren't there. That's what you did. Not just with the cruelty I could survive. You made me doubt my own perception." Serafina's hands were still on the table. "I had a mother," Imani said. "She worked double shifts. She didn't give me much, but she gave me the ability to trust what I saw in front of me. You spent 9 years trying to take that from me." Serafina's chin moved slightly. She was not crying. She was a woman who did not cry in public, and possibly not in private either. And whatever she was feeling was happening somewhere inaccessible. "I'm sorry," Serafina said. The 2 words landed with all the weight that 2 words can carry when they are the only words available for something that exceeds them. "I know that's not enough," she added. "No," Imani said. "It's not." Dominic had not spoken since they sat down. He had held his water glass and looked at the table between the 2 women and let what needed to happen. Because Imani had asked him to, and because she was right. Now he looked at his mother. "I need to tell you what the last 2 weeks have cost," he said. Serafina looked at him. "Not the accounts. Not the restructuring. What it cost me to find out that while my wife was telling me she felt the family closing in on her, you were in a meeting with Marco deciding how to limit what she could walk away with." His voice was steady and hard, the voice he used in specific rooms for specific purposes, and this was the first time he had ever used it with his mother. You turned my inability to listen to my wife into an operational advantage. You used the space my failure left open. Serafina's breath changed slightly. Her chest moved. I'm not forgiving you today, he said. That's not what this meeting is. But I need you to hear it from me directly. What you built? What you did to her? What you used Marco to do? I'm not separating that from who you are to me. That is who you are. I loved my mother. I love you. And you used that love to protect something that mattered more to you than she did. I need you to know that. I know that. The restaurant kept going around them, oblivious, warm, full of other people's Saturdays. Serafina sat very still. Then she said, very quietly, to Imani, you weren't what I wanted for him. I told myself a story about what that meant, about protecting him. She looked at the table, then back up. There was a woman at my husband's family's table for 30 years who was always right and beautiful and always everything those women were supposed to be. I spent 30 years next to her, feeling like I was performing. Something shifted in her face, subtle, the kind of thing you could miss if you weren't watching closely. I became her when I had the chance. I don't have any excuse that makes that right. The table was very quiet. Imani looked at this woman, looked at her for a long time. The woman who had spent 9 years making her feel like a problem, 4 years building a financial architecture against her, a lifetime becoming something that could do all of it while setting a beautiful table and serving good wine. I hear you, Imani said, finally. I'm not able to tell you what that changes today. I don't know yet what it changes. Serafina nodded. But I need one thing to be clear, Imani said. Whatever relationship exists going forward between you and Micah goes through me. Not around me. Not in the spaces where I'm not present. Through me. That's the line. Serafina looked at her son. Dominic said nothing. He waited. Serafina looked back at Imani. Agreed. Imani held her gaze for another long moment. Then she picked up her coffee, which had gone cold while they talked, and she drank it anyway. And she set it down and looked at the window beside their table, where the gray November light was doing its flat best. Dominic's phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. It vibrated again. He reached for it involuntarily, the way you do when something is insistent, and glanced at the screen under the table. Carla. 3 times in 2 minutes he stood up. Excuse me. He moved toward the back of the restaurant, near the hallway to the restrooms where the ambient noise dropped slightly, and called Carla back. She answered before the first ring finished. The Giordano account moved this morning, she said. Not Paul Sr. Giordano. Someone reached him directly. Dominic, the Carlotti licenses. Her voice had a quality he had never heard in 11 years of working together. Not panic. Carla didn't panic, but urgency stripped of the professional cushion she normally kept around it. The licenses were transferred out of your operating structure this morning, before we could execute the filing. Someone moved faster than we did. He stood in the hallway of a midtown restaurant, with November light through the windows and the sound of his wife and his mother at a table, 30 feet behind him, and he looked at a spot on the wall and felt the specific sensation of the ground. He thought he'd secured shifting beneath him, all over again. When, he said, 11:47 this morning. 43 minutes ago, he looked at his watch. They had arrived at the restaurant at 11:30. Serafina had arrived at 11:37. Carla, he said. Someone knew we were in this meeting today. Silence for 2 seconds. Yes. He turned and looked toward the table, where Imani was sitting across from his mother, and his mother was sitting with her hands flat on the table, in the posture of a woman who had just delivered an apology. The move had happened 43 minutes ago. 8 minutes after Serafina walked through that door. While Serafina was sitting across from Imani saying, I'm sorry, someone with access to the Carlotti structure had executed a financial transfer that Dominic's team had been 6 hours away from blocking. He walked back to the table. He stood beside his chair and looked at his mother. Serafina looked up at him. Her hands were still flat on the table. Her expression was what it had been, the careful composure of a woman who had just said something difficult and was waiting to see where it landed. Who else knew about this meeting, he said. She blinked. What? Who else knew we were going to be in this room today, at this time? Something moved across Serafina's face. Fast. Gone before he could fully read it. I don't know what you. The Carlotti licenses moved this morning, he said. 43 minutes ago. While we were sitting here, the restaurant noise continued. Plates somewhere, low conversation. The normal sound of a Saturday afternoon in the city. Serafina's hands on the table were very still. Too still. The stillness of someone who is not surprised by information they should be surprised by. Dominic looked at his mother and understood, in one terrible clearing second, that the meeting had not been what he thought it was. The apology had been. The apology had been a distraction. Dominic stood at the table and looked at his mother and understood it completely, in the space of 3 seconds. The way you understand certain things, only after the evidence assembles past the point where any other explanation holds the stillness of her hands, the absence of surprise in her face, the specific quality of her eyes when he said 43 minutes ago, which not the quality of a woman receiving shocking news, but the quality of a woman receiving a report on something she already knew the status of. She had called this meeting. She had agreed to sit across from Amani and say the words, "I was wrong. What I did was cruel. I'm sorry." She had delivered them with enough genuine weight that he had almost believed the meeting was what it appeared to be. While they were sitting in this room, someone she'd already positioned had executed the transfer. She had needed them in one place, occupied for a specific window of time. "Who did you call?" he said. Serafina looked up at him. Composure was still there. That was the thing about his mother. The composure never fully left. It was structural, built into her at a level below conscious management. "Dominic, who did you call?" he said again, same volume, same flatness. The voice from the hallway that stopped rooms. Amani had turned in her chair and was looking at him. He could see her, in his peripheral vision, reading the situation, processing the shift in the room the way she always did, quickly, accurately, without needing it explained. "You needed us in this room," Dominic said. "You called this meeting. You knew we'd both be here. I came here to apologize to your wife. You came here to occupy 40 minutes. He pulled out his chair and sat down, not because he was calm, but because standing over her was the wrong position for what he needed to say, and he knew it. Eye level. Direct. Someone executed a transfer on the Carlotti licenses this morning, while we're sitting here. The window they needed was while Carla's team was unable to file the blocking documents, because I was in this restaurant. You knew I'd have my phone on silent for a meeting with you. You knew Carla wouldn't interrupt unless it was critical. You built a 40-minute window." Serafina said nothing. "The apology was real enough," he said. "That's the part I'll give you. Some of what you said was real. But the timing of this meeting wasn't chosen because you were ready to say it." Imani set down her coffee cup. The small sound of it on the saucer was very precise in the quiet between them. "Tell me I'm wrong," Dominic said to his mother. Serafina looked at the table. Her hand still flat, didn't move. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said again. She looked up, and in her eyes not guilt exactly. Nothing as clean as guilt was the look of a person who has been known completely by another person and has no remaining architecture to hide behind. "I did call someone this morning," she said. The table was absolutely still. "Before I came here," she said, "I called someone and I told them today was the day, that you would be here." "Who?" She said a name he didn't recognize. "Not Marco. Not anyone from the inner structure. A name from the outer edge of the Carlotti arrangement, someone positioned close enough to execute but distant enough that the connection to Serafina wasn't obvious." "You built a backup," Dominic said. "I built a contingency. After Friday. After you knew I'd signed documents." "Yes. So when you called this morning and agreed to meet, you had already activated the contingency." "Yes." He sat with that. Amani was very still beside him. He could feel her presence the way you feel weather not looking at her. Just aware of the specific quality of air around her, which had changed. "I don't understand something," Amani said. Both of them looked at her. Her voice was quiet, not shaking. Quiet in the way of something that has been pulled very tight. "You sat across from me 20 minutes ago and told me what you did was wrong. You looked at me and said the word cruel. You said you told yourself a different story about what you were actually doing." She was looking at Serafina with an expression that Dominic had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not hurt. Something past both of those. Were any of those words real? Any of them at all? Serafina met her eyes. "Yes," she said. "But you'd already made the call." "Yes." "So you meant what you said and you did it anyway." Serafina's jaw worked slightly. "I have been running this family for 35 years. I have been doing what needed to be done for 35 years. Some of what needed to be done. She stopped. Looked at her own hands. Some of it I regret. The how. Not always the what. You still think I'm the what, Amani said. Silence. You sat here and apologized to me, and you still think removing me is the right outcome. You just regret the method. Serafina looked at her. I think my son was building a life I understood, and you redirected him toward one I didn't. I think that's still true. I think she paused. I think I was wrong about what I was protecting. But I am 61 years old, and I have been certain about very few things for very long times. It was one of them. Then the apology was what? Amani said. Practice? The apology was true, Serafina said, with the first real heat she had shown all morning. Both things can be true. I can regret what I did to you and still believe that what I was fighting for was worth doing it to me, Amani said. The sentence landed. Serafina closed her mouth. Dominic looked at his mother and felt something he hadn't expected to feel in this room, which was a kind of grief. Not for the situation, not for the accounts, or the licenses, or the 14 months of construction. Grief for the specific recognition of a person he had known his entire life being fully visible for the first time, and what was visible being irreconcilable with the version he had carried. He loved his mother. He had loved her his whole life with the particular love of a son, for a woman who had been iron and capable and ferociously present through everything his father's death. The years of building, the years of maintaining, the years of holding the family together with the specific force of her will. He loved her, and she had spent 4 years building a weapon aimed at his wife. Both things were true. He was beginning to understand that both things being true simultaneously was the hardest kind of fact to carry. I need to make a call, he said. He stood up, looked at Amani. I'll be right back. She nodded, one small movement. Her eyes stayed on Serafina. He walked to the back hallway again and called Carla. How bad is the damage? He said when she answered. The licenses are gone from your operating structure. To reverse it requires a legal filing that will take... She paused, working through it. Minimum 3 weeks, possibly 6. In the meantime, you can't operate those restaurants through the existing LLC. You'd need to restructure the holding. What does that cost? She told him. It was significant. Not catastrophic. He had anticipated worse, which meant his mother had known the outer limit of what would be survivable and had aimed just inside it. She wanted to hurt him, not destroy him. She wanted leverage, not war. Which told him something worth she thought this was still going. Do it, he said. All of it. Whatever the cost. Start Monday. Dominic, the timeline on the Carlotti accounts.
I know.
Do what you can. The priority is making sure Amani's legal protections are filed first, before any of the operational restructuring. Her protections first, everything else after. A brief pause. Understood, I'll have it ready. He ended the call, stood in the back hallway, looked at the wall, different wall than Carla's office, painted a neutral restaurant beige, utterly blank. He thought about his father's chair, about the morning he had sat in it at 4A. and read Carla's documents and understood the shape of what had been built. About all the mornings before that he had sat in it and made decisions about operations and territories and relationships and had never once sat in it and thought carefully about what was happening inside his own house. He had been a very effective man in a very small room. He walked back to the table. Amani was looking out the window. Serafina was looking at the table. The two women who had defined the central conflict of the last several weeks were sitting 3 feet apart in a midtown restaurant on a gray November Saturday, and the space between them had the specific quality of aftermath, not resolution, just the end of the acute phase. He sat down. He looked at his mother. Here's what happens now, he said. Carla is filing the protective documents for Amani today, by end of business. Whatever the licenses cost to restructure, I'll handle. Whatever damage your contingency did, I'll handle. He kept his voice level. You cost me money. That's survivable. I want you to understand that clearly you used the one real piece of leverage you had, and I'm still not coming back to the table. The accounts, the structure with Marco, the contingency this morning. You've used everything available to you, and I'm still sitting here with my wife. Serafina looked at him. Which means you're out of moves, he said. And I need you to understand what that means for what comes next. Not as a threat, as a fact. What does it mean? She said. It means the next move is entirely yours. Not strategically, there's no strategy left. I mean, who you decide to be from this point. With Amani, with Micah, with me. He looked at the table for a moment, then back up. I'm not cutting you off permanently. You're my mother. Micah loves you. Those things are real regardless of everything else. But access to my son goes through Imani. My relationship with you is going to be rebuilt from nothing, if it gets rebuilt at all, and it gets rebuilt on terms she agrees with. Not mine. Hers. Serafina's eyes moved to Imani. And the only reason any of that is possible, Dominic said, is because she's a better person than the situation required her to be. The table was quiet for a long moment. Then Imani said, to Serafina, directly, without looking at Dominic, I need to ask you one more thing. Serafina waited. The things you said to me in that drawing room, the ones about where I came from, about Baltimore, about my family. Imani's voice was steady. Did you believe them? Not as tactics. Did you actually believe them? Serafina was quiet for several seconds. I believed some of them, she said finally. Some of them were… She pressed her lips together. Some of them were what I told myself to make the rest of it feel justified. Which parts did you believe? That you came from a different world. Serafina looked at her hands. That the world you came from wasn't the world he was built for. I believed that. And now? Serafina looked up. Now I think the world I built him for wasn't as important as I believed it was. That's not the same as believing you were wrong about me, Imani said. No, Serafina said, it's not. Imani nodded. I appreciate that you didn't pretend it was. Something shifted in Serafina's expression, imperceptible to anyone who didn't know her face. Dominic caught it. It was not warmth. It was not reconciliation. It was something more elemental than either of those, the specific recognition of specific between two women of a line of honesty that had been maintained even through everything that surrounded it. I didn't come from your world, Imani said. My mother cleaned other people's houses. My grandmother picked tobacco in South Carolina. I went to school on financial aid, and I worked double shifts in grad school, and I didn't have a name that opened doors. She looked at Serafina directly, and I built a good life. With your son. In a world that wasn't mine. And everything you did for 14 months was designed to make sure that if that world ever ended, I'd leave it with nothing. She paused. I need you to sit with what that means. Not for me. For what it says about who you decided to be. Serafina said nothing. She sat with it. And for the first time since he'd known his mother, Dominic watched her receive something without managing it. Without repositioning it. Without finding the angle that made her the reasonable one. She just sat with Imani's words in the middle of a midtown restaurant and let them be what they were. He didn't know if it would last. He didn't know if 61 years of a particular formation could shift in the aftermath of a particular conversation. He thought probably it was more complicated than that. He thought probably the road from this table to whatever came next was going to be longer and more irregular than any of them wanted. But she sat with it. That was something. They left the restaurant separately. Serafina first she stood, put on her coat with the precise movements of a woman who had been putting on coats in restaurants for 40 years, picked up her bag, and looked at Dominic with an expression that contained 36 years of their shared history, which was too much for any single expression to hold, and which therefore came out as something incomplete and complicated. I'll call Carla, she said, about the contingency. I'll have it reversed where it can be reversed. He hadn't expected that. He didn't show that he hadn't expected it. Thank you, he said. She looked at Imani one more time. A look that lasted just a second and contained something Dominic couldn't fully translate, not an apology. They'd already had that. Something less organized than an apology. Something more like the beginning of a reckoning that she was going to have to finish on her own time, in private, without an audience. Then she walked out. They watched her go. The restaurant kept happening around them. Plates and conversation and the gray November light through the window and 2 cups of cold coffee on a table between them. Imani looked at the door where Serafina had gone, then at the table, then at him. She's going to have to decide who she is without the strategy, Imani said. It's going to be hard for her. Yes. I'm not going to feel sorry for her about it. You don't have to. But I'm also not… She stopped, looked at the window. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life angry at her. That's not… I can't carry that. It's too heavy and it's not mine to carry anymore. He reached across the table, put his hand over hers. She turned her palm up. Same gesture as the car, weeks ago, driving home from Connecticut with Micah asleep in the back seat. The same simple act that had been the one clear thing in an unclear night. I need to tell you something, she said. Tell me. She looked at their hands on the table. There were 3 times in the last 2 years where I was close to leaving. Not because of Serafina, because of you. Because of the specific feeling of telling the person you love that you're in pain, and having them tell you that you're wrong about your own pain. She looked up at him. Stayed because I love you, and because I kept believing the version of you that showed up, sometimes the version I married, was the more real version. I kept betting on that version, being the one that would eventually win. He held her gaze. I need you to know that the bet wasn't guaranteed, she said. I need you to know there were nights where I was done. Not dramatically. Not in a fight, just quietly done, in a way that would have been very hard to come back from. I know, he said. I'm sorry I made you keep making that bet alone. She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she always did, with the accuracy she had developed over 9 years of loving a man who had spent those same 9 years making it harder than it should have been. Then she squeezed his hand once. Okay, she said. Okay. Marco came to the house that Sunday. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands. Literally the watch cap he'd been wearing against the cold, removed when Dominic answered, held against his chest in both hands. A gesture Dominic had not seen from Marco in their adult lives. I came to see Imani, Marco said. If she'll see me. Dominic stepped back and let him in. Imani was in the kitchen. She appeared in the hallway and looked at Marco standing in her entryway with his hat in his hands. And she looked at him for a moment, long enough that Marco shifted his weight slightly. And then she said, Come in. I'll make coffee. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Marco had sat 3 nights ago when Dominic had taken apart their 30 years, with a series of precise sentences. The table where the pasta had gone cold while the truth assembled itself. Marco talked. He told Imani what he had told Dominic, and then he told her more, the specific conversations with Serafina, the specific framing she had used, the way she had made him feel like protecting Dominic's operations from her was the same as protecting Dominic. He told it plainly, without trying to make himself look better than he was. Imani listened. When he finished, she sat with her coffee mug and said, You knew her contempt for me was real. You'd seen it. Yes, Marco said, and you helped her anyway. I told myself it was about the money, about protecting the structure. He looked at the table. But yeah, I let the things she believed about you affect me more than I admitted to myself. What did she believe about me? Marco looked up. That you didn't belong. That Dom had made a romantic decision that was going to cost the family. He paused. She said it enough times that I stopped. I stopped examining whether it was true. Imani looked at him. You've been at my dinner table. You held my son. I know. You held him the day he was born. Marco's jaw tightened. His eyes had the look of a man confronting the full weight of something he'd been able to keep at a manageable distance, while it was abstract. In a kitchen, at a table with the actual woman, it was not abstract anymore. I'm sorry, Imani, he said. I can't make it the right size. I'm sorry. She held his gaze for a long time. Then she said, I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. But I'm also not going to make you carry it every time I'm in the same room as you. That's not something I want to live inside. She picked up her mug. What you do with it is your business. I just needed you to say it directly. Marco nodded. Something in his face shifted, not relief. It was too complicated for relief. More like the specific feeling of having been given a door where you expected a wall and not being entirely sure you deserved the door. He left an hour later. Dominic walked him out. At the door, Marco stopped, put his hat back on, looked at Dominic with a face of 30 years between them. She's remarkable, Marco said. I know that. I know. Dominic looked at him. You made a choice. We'll deal with the northeastern matter through Carla, and it'll be handled, and then it's dealt with. But Marco, he paused. The next time someone uses your love for me as a reason to do something to my family, I need you to be a different kind of man than you were this time. Marco held his gaze. Yeah, he said. I know, they didn't hug on the doorstep. They didn't need to. 30 years doesn't require a gesture. It's either there or it isn't. And both of them knew that what it was now was damaged but present, which was better than the alternative and worse than before, and that was the honest math of it. The weeks that followed moved in the irregular rhythm of things being rebuilt. Carla executed the filings. Serafina true to her word at the restaurant. Reversed the contingency transfer, where it could be reversed, not all of it. Some of the damage was structural and required the longer legal process. But she made the calls she said she would, and that meant something even if it didn't fix everything. The restaurant licenses took 6 weeks. The Carlotti restructuring took 8. The financial picture at the end of it was different than it had been, not worse overall. Just different. Certain alliances renegotiated. Certain structures rebuilt from clean foundations, without the arrangements that Serafina's leverage had depended on. Paul Giordano called once, 3 weeks after the restaurant, to say that his arrangement with Dominic was unchanged, and that he was sorry for the position his own family had been put in. Dominic said he appreciated the call. Paul said no more than he needed to, and ended the call at under 4 minutes, which Dominic respected. Amani hired her own lawyer. The lawyer reviewed everything Carla had built and found one additional thing that needed adjusting, a detail in the structure of Micah's trust, and had it corrected. Process took 2 weeks. Amani met with the lawyer 3 times without Dominic present, which he had no part in arranging and no comment about, which was how it was supposed to be. Micah's birthday fell in December. The party was small, a few kids from school, Amani's mother who flew up from Baltimore, and who Dominic had always gotten along with, in the quiet way of 2 people who respected each other without having yet found what to say about it. She was a compact woman with Amani's eyes and a way of watching things that missed nothing. And she hugged her daughter at the door the way mothers do when they've been worried from a distance and are checking that the person is actually intact. Micah ran the remote-controlled car through the kitchen for most of the afternoon. The thing was genuinely fast. It had taken a wall twice and survived both. At one point, while the cake was being organized, Amani's mother found herself standing next to Dominic in the kitchen, and they watched Micah through the doorway. "My daughter is strong," she said. Not as a compliment, as information. "I know," Dominic said. "She doesn't always let people know when something is breaking. She learned that early." She looked at the cake Imani was fixing candles into. "She's not going to tell you when she's about to break. You have to pay attention." "I'm learning to," he said. She looked at him with those eyes. The ones Micah had. The ones that could read rooms from across them. "Good," she said, and went to help with the candles. The call from Serafina came in January. Not to Dominic. To Amani. Amani told him about it that evening, after Micah was in bed told him directly. The same way she'd been telling him things since October. She said Serafina had called and asked if she could come see Micah. She said Serafina had not asked Dominic first. She said the call was short and that Serafina had used the word please, which Amani said landed differently than she'd expected. "What did you say?" Dominic said. "I said I'd think about it." She looked at her hands on the kitchen table. "I said I'd let her know." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Micah loves her. He's asked about her twice since October, and I told him she was dealing with some things, and he accepted that because he's 7 and 7-year-olds accept what you tell them." She looked up. "I'm thinking that what she did was real, and what she apologized for was real, and what she did while she was apologizing was also real. All of it at the same time." "Yeah," he said. "I'm thinking that the line I said at the restaurant was that she comes in through me. If I say she can come, that's me holding the line, not breaking it. And if you say she can't, then she can't." Amani was quiet for a moment. "But I don't think keeping Micah away from his grandmother is the right answer, just because his grandmother is a complicated and difficult woman. I think Micah gets to know her and make his own decisions over time about who she is." She paused. "With supervision." "My supervision." "That's your call," he said. "I know it's my call." She said it evenly, without edge, not reminding him, just confirming it. "I think you're making the right one," he said. "I might not be. It might be a mistake. It might be. But it's mine to make." "Yes," he said. "Diz." She called Serafina the next morning. A short call. She gave her a date Sunday afternoon, 2 hours. Dominic's house. Amani would be there. Dominic would be there. It would start from there and see where it went. Serafina said she understood. She said thank you. Then, before ending the call, she said something that Amani told Dominic about that night. She'd said, "I know this is more than I gave you. I want you to know I know that." Amani had said, "I know you know. That's why I called you back." The Sunday afternoon came. Micah heard the car in the driveway and appeared at the top of the stairs in his socks, sliding slightly on the last step, catching the banister, looking down at his parents in the entryway, with the question already in his face. "Grandma," he said. "Grandma," Dominic confirmed. Micah sat on the stairs and put his shoes on wrong feet first, then corrected with the focused urgency of a child who has been waiting for something they didn't want to directly ask for. Serafina came through the door with a gift for Micah, modestly sized, wrapped in the careful way she wrapped everything. She looked at Amani first, which Dominic noticed. Not at him, at Amani. "Thank you for having me," she said. Amani held her gaze for a moment. "Come in," she said. Micah came off the stairs and crossed the entryway and hugged his grandmother with the uncomplicated completeness of a child who had not yet learned to qualify his affections. He wrapped both arms around her and pressed his face against her coat, and she stood very still for a moment and then put her arms around him and held him. Dominic looked at Amani. She was watching, her arms loosely at her sides. Her expression was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the expression of a woman who has survived a significant thing and is standing in the aftermath of it with her eyes open, paying attention, making no assumptions about what came next. She felt him looking. She glanced at him. Something passed between them that didn't need a word. Not happiness exactly. The situation was too complicated for uncomplicated happiness. Something more like recognition of where they were, of how they'd gotten there, of the distance between that hallway and the hallway in Connecticut 3 months ago, where he'd stood with a birthday gift in his hand and heard his mother's voice, and understood, too late, but not too late, what his wife had been living inside. Micah let go of Serafina and looked up at her. "I got a really fast car," he said. "Do you want to see it go?" "I would like that very much," Serafina said. Micah took her hand and pulled her toward the kitchen with the confidence of a child who has no reason to be anything other than certain of his welcome. Serafina followed him. She glanced back once at Imani, not Dominic, and what was in that glance was not simple, would not have been translatable to anyone who hadn't been inside the last 3 months. But what it held was something that had not been there before. Not warmth, not love. The beginning, possibly, of something that could become respect, which was smaller than reconciliation and more honest than forgiveness, and was, for today, enough. They stood in the entryway alone for a moment. From the kitchen came the sound of the remote-controlled car hitting the baseboard, and Micah's laugh and Serafina saying something in a tone of voice Dominic hadn't heard from her in years, unguarded, actually surprised by the car's speed. "She called you first," he said. "Yes. Not me." "Yes." Amani looked at the kitchen doorway. "Think she understood something." "What?" "That the door she needed to come through wasn't yours." She looked at him. "You were never the problem she had to solve." "I was. She had to come to me." He thought about that. "Are you okay with today?" She considered it genuinely. "I'm okay with today. Ask me again in 6 months, I will." "I know you will," she said. "That's the part that's different now." He looked at her. "You'd ask before," she said. "But you'd be listening for the answer that meant you didn't have to do anything. Now you ask because you actually want to know." She tilted her head slightly. "I can tell the difference. I always could. I know you could. I just wanted you to know that I know," she said. "That you know." From the kitchen, Micah called out for both of them. Car needed an audience. It needed to be witnessed going very fast. It needed parents and grandmothers gathered around the kitchen floor to watch it demonstrate what it was capable of. Dominic put his hand at the small of Amani's back, not taking her arm, not leading, just present, beside her, the simplest physical statement of where he intended to be. She didn't lean into it or away from it. She walked forward and he walked beside her, and they went into the kitchen together. The car was already going. Micah had it running the full length of the kitchen, and it was genuinely fast, too fast for the room, probably. But that was the nature of things built to demonstrate what they could do. It hit the far wall with a sharp plastic sound and reversed and came back. And Micah was narrating its performance with the passionate inaccuracy of a 7-year-old sports commentator who has never let not knowing the right words slow him down. Serafina was watching it with her hands folded and an expression that was, Dominic thought, the closest thing to undefended he had ever seen on her face. The expression of a woman watching her grandson in a house she had tried to dismantle, and understanding what that house contained that she had been willing to lose. He did not feel sorry for her. He did not feel triumph either. He felt the weight of everything it had taken to arrive in this kitchen on this Sunday afternoon. The hallway in Connecticut, the drawn room and the envelope, the midnight call from Carla, the restaurant and the apology and the contingency that ran simultaneously, the 4 a.m. mornings in his father's chair, and he held all of it without flinching from any of it, because it was the true shape of the thing, and the true shape of things was the only foundation anything lasting could be built on. Car hit the wall again, reversed, came back. Micah looked up at his parents with the specific joy of a child whose world is, right now, in this kitchen, complete. Imani smiled. Dominic smuttered a smile and thought about what she had said in the car 3 months ago, driving home from Connecticut, with the truth of everything in the air around them. He had reached over and put his hand on hers. She had turned her palm up. Such a small thing. He had not understood then what it cost her. What it had always cost her, the continued act of turning her palm up for a man who had not always deserved the gesture. Believing anyway that the version of him she had chosen was the real one. Making a bet she hadn't been required to keep making. She had been right about him. Not because he's the man he should have been. Because he had become slowly and imperfectly, and too late and not too late, the man the bet required. He reached over and took her hand. She didn't look at him. She was watching Micah, smiling at the car, present in her kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, with the full complicated weight of everything that had brought them here. And she did not look at him, but her fingers closed around his, and they stood there together while the car ran its circuits on the kitchen floor. And the gray winter light came through the windows and made everything in the room the same quiet color. And the story of them, the real story beneath all the other stories, went on.